A teenage girl went to a WNBA game with a sign. That is how this started. Not a fight, not a dirty foul, not a screaming match between players. A sign, a simple sign supporting Sophie Cunningham, and by the end of the night, according to the fan's own account, she had been yelled at by an adult connected to team ownership. Security had gotten involved, and she was left crying in the arena. At first, it looked like a small incident in the stands, but according to the fan's account, after displaying a sign supporting Sophie Cunningham, she was confronted by an adult connected to the Seattle Storm. Security became involved, and she left the arena in tears. While parts of the incident remain disputed, it quickly sparked a much broader debate about fan treatment, free expression, and how the WNBA handles controversial viewpoints. So let's break it all down. What the fan says happened, why Sophie Cunningham was at the center of it, why the Seattle ownership angle matters so much, and why this moment says a lot more about the WNBA right now than any final score ever could. Because once you strip away the noise, the real question is simple. Can a young fan quietly support a player's beliefs at a WNBA game without being humiliated for it? That should not be a hard question, and yet here we are. The sign was not random. To understand why this got so heated so fast, you have to understand what Sophie Cunningham had already said before this game ever happened. A few weeks earlier, Sophie had been asked directly about protecting women's sports. She did not dodge it. She did not hide behind vague PR language. She did not try to soften it into something safer. She said she meant what she said. She talked about protecting girls in sports. She referenced Title IX. She said she believed in protecting biological women in women's spaces. And when reporters later circled back and gave her every opportunity to step away from that position, she did not. She repeated it calmly. She also added that she does not hate anyone. She said there is room for everyone, but she made it clear that she was not going to abandon what she believes just because the backlash got louder. That matters. Because whether people agreed with Sophie or not, nobody could honestly say she was being slippery about it. She was not chasing ambiguity. She was not teasing outrage for clout. She was answering directly and then standing on the answer. That turned her into something bigger than a rotation player. It made her a symbol to supporters. She became one of the few athletes willing to say something they believe a lot of people are afraid to say. To critics, she became a player inserting herself into one of the most divisive debates in sports with a level of certainty they found deeply troubling. So by the time the Seattle game arrived, she was no longer just a player. She was carrying a public meaning. And that is why a sign thanking Sophie Cunningham for speaking up for girls was never going to be treated as a neutral object. It was a statement, not rude, not vulgar, not threatening, but definitely a statement. And that is what gave the incident its charge. What the fan says happened, according to the account shared afterward, the girl and the people with her said they were sitting courtside, holding a sign supporting Sophie Cunningham. They say they were not screaming abuse. They say they were not targeting players. They say they were simply holding the sign and watching the game. Then, according to their version of events, an older woman approached them. At first, the girl thought the woman was going to be nice. Instead, according to what she later described, the interaction escalated quickly. She says they were yelled at. She says they were spoken to aggressively. She says they were told to stop. She says the language turned hostile. And by the end of the exchange, security had gotten involved and she was crying. That is the image that stayed with people. Not a political argument, not a social media quote, a crying teenager at a basketball game. That is what gave this story emotional force, because even people who disagree with the sign itself can still look at that outcome and ask, why did it need to go there? If the sign broke a venue rule, then explain the rule calmly. If the issue was placement or visibility, handle it like professionals. But if the fan's account is accurate, this did not feel like calm rule enforcement. It felt personal, and once something feels personal between a powerful adult and a teenage fan, people stop seeing it as policy. They see it as intimidation. Why the ownership angle changes everything. This story would already be ugly if it were just a random fan confrontation. But what made it explode was the claim that the woman involved was not just any spectator. She was identified as a minority owner tied to the Seattle Storm. That changes the entire meaning of the moment. Because owners are not ordinary fans. They are not just another person in the crowd reacting emotionally. They are part of the organization. They are part of the public face of the team. They help define the environment inside that building, whether they mean to or not. So if a team owner or anyone in a similar position of authority confronts a teenage fan over a peaceful sign, the issue is no longer interpersonal. It becomes institutional. Because then people start asking, if this is how ownership reacts to one silent sign, what exactly counts as acceptable support in that arena? That is the question at the center of all this. Not just, did someone get offended? Not, was the sign political? Not, do people disagree about Sophie Cunningham? The real question is whether a fan can peacefully support a player whose views are controversial without being treated like a problem that needs to be removed. If the answer is no, then this is not a tolerance story. It is a control story. And that is why the ownership angle matters so much. To many observers, it raised concerns about how someone in a position of authority responded to a young fan. That perception is one reason the story spread so quickly. The WNBA talks about inclusion all the time. This is what makes the entire thing hit even harder. The WNBA and its teams talk constantly about inclusion, belonging, safety, welcome, and voice. Those are big values, and if you claim those values publicly, people are going to test whether you mean them when the moment gets uncomfortable. That is exactly what happened here, because inclusion is easy when everybody in the room agrees. Welcome is easy when every sign and shirt fits the same worldview. Safety is easy when nobody's expressing anything that challenges the culture of the building. The test comes when someone quietly expresses a view that people in power strongly dislike. That is when you find out whether the standard is really openness or just ideological comfort, and that is why this story spread beyond sports fans. Because even people who had never heard of Sophie Cunningham could understand the visual. A teenage girl with a sign, a powerful adult confronting her, security getting involved, tears. That is a universal picture, and for a league that wants to be seen as modern, inclusive, and fan-friendly, that picture is a disaster, because once fans start believing that only certain viewpoints are allowed inside the arena, the language of inclusion starts sounding selective. Critics argued that if some viewpoints appear welcome while others do not, the league risks creating the perception of selective inclusion. That is the harsh read a lot of people took away from this incident, why the sign mattered more than the words on it. One of the most important parts of this whole story is that the sign, as described, was not an attack. It was not insulting any Storm player. It was not mocking anyone personally. It was not profanity. It was not harassment. It was support. Support for a player, support for what that player had said, and that is why the response looks so disproportionate to so many people. Because if a supportive sign triggers that level of reaction, then the message fans hear is not, please follow arena rules. The message they hear is, that kind of support is not welcome here. That is what turns a small incident into a big one. Fans are used to arenas being full of messages, signs, shirts, chants, political gestures, social statements, cause-based apparel. Sports spaces constantly tolerate expressive behavior as long as the expression points in the approved direction. The moment people feel that one type of message gets celebrated and another gets shut down, the word double standard appears immediately. That is what happened here. Not because every sign must be allowed no matter what, but because people are extremely sensitive to inconsistency when the inconsistency lines up with politics. And once that perception locks in, the organization loses control of the narrative. The response online was never going to stay small. The reason this blew up so fast is that it sat right at the intersection of multiple live debates at the same time. It involved Sophie Cunningham girls, sports, transgender participation, WNBA culture, fan treatment, ownership, power, league hypocrisy. That is basically a perfect storm for online reaction. Supporters of Sophie saw the incident as confirmation that people who claim to be tolerant often become aggressive the second someone publicly defends female-only sports spaces. Critics of Sophie saw the sign itself as part of a broader political provocation and believed the presence of that message was bound to create conflict. But even among people who had mixed or unclear opinions on the larger issue, a lot of them still landed on the same basic reaction. Why is an adult owner yelling at a teenage fan? That part is hard to defend. And once that became the central image, the story escaped the usual sports bubble completely, because now it was not just a WNBA political spat. It was about power and vulnerability, a young fan on one side, an owner-backed adult on the other. That visual always wins attention. Why this was not just about Seattle. The easiest mistake people can make is to treat this as one ugly moment involving one team. It is bigger than that. Because this incident landed in a league that already feels culturally tense. The WNBA is growing, the audience is changing, the money is changing, the political visibility is changing, and that creates pressure. Some fans are showing up because they love the basketball, some are showing up because they love the activism, some are showing up because they love a specific player, some are showing up because they are already invested in the wider cultural debates. That means the arena is no longer just a basketball space, it is also a symbolic space, and symbolic spaces become contested spaces very fast. That is what Seattle exposed. Not that disagreement exists, everybody already knew that. It exposed what happens when disagreement becomes visible in the building itself. When the person holding the wrong message is not another adult activist, not a media personality, not a rival player, but a kid. That is what made people flinch, because once a child becomes the face of the incident, the whole emotional balance changes. You can argue with a political opponent, you can boo a player, you can dislike a viewpoint, but screaming at a teenager over a sign crosses into something else, something smaller, meaner, harder to justify. The league problem underneath all of this is the bigger issue the WNBA has to deal with. If fans believe that only certain viewpoints are acceptable in league spaces, then the league is no longer functioning as a broad sports product. It is functioning as a filtered cultural space. Maybe some people inside the league are comfortable with that. But there is a cost, because broad sports leagues grow by expanding tolerance for who shows up, not shrinking it. That does not mean allowing hate. That does not mean accepting slurs, threats, or harassment. But it does mean understanding the difference between disagreement, advocacy, discomfort, and actual abuse. If a thank you sign for a player's stance gets treated as abuse, the public starts doubting the seriousness of the league's entire language around safety and inclusion. That is dangerous, because once words like safe and welcome start sounding ideological instead of universal, trust erodes quickly. And sports leagues run on trust. Trust that fans can show up. Trust that they can cheer. Trust that they can support players they believe in. Trust that the arena is not going to police them politically in uneven ways. If that trust disappears, so does some of the goodwill the league depends on. That is why this story matters, not because it changes the standings, not because it is the biggest story in sports, but because it strikes directly at the relationship between league and fan. And right now, that relationship is more fragile than the WNBA probably wants to admit. The real takeaway. So what actually happened here? At minimum, according to the people involved, a teenage fan went to a WNBA game with a sign supporting Sophie Cunningham, got confronted by a powerful adult tied to the home team, and left the situation crying. That alone is a bad look. If the fan's account is accurate, the incident raises difficult questions about how arenas should balance fan expression, security, and respectful treatment of spectators. It also highlights how quickly disagreements over controversial issues can become much larger conversations about the WNBA itself. And that is a much bigger problem than one awkward exchange in the stands, because this story is not really about a sign. It is about what the sign represented. It is about who was allowed to display belief openly. It is about who got told to be quiet. And it is about whether the WNBA genuinely building a space for fans or only for the right kinds of fans. That is why this story hit so hard, and that is why people are still talking about it. Not because it was loud, but because it revealed something. A league can say it welcomes everyone, but moments like this are when people decide whether they believe it.